Cells are extremely useful when standard symbols or detail drawings must be placed once or repeated many times in a design. A good example is the tree detail that we used in the previous videos and which was placed many times and at different scales. If the tree detail was saved as a cell, that cell could then be placed as often as necessary in the current design and would also be available for use in any other design too. Although cells are usually small collections of elements, they can be of any size. Cells are easy to create and are stored in cell libraries. A cell library is then attached to the current model, and all cells in that library are accessible to the current model. Cell libraries are separate files with a .cel extension and are fully transportable to any other computer or networks. Cell libraries stored on a network can be accessed by all workstations having access to that network, ensuring that symbols and details are always consistent. And MicroStation provides predefined cell libraries, but you can easily create your own, and we'll be doing that in later videos. Now, MicroStation provides many cell libraries containing predefined cells. Some are for general use, while others are specific to various drafting divisions. Cell libraries are contained in the Bentley Workspace System Cell directory path, which we'll see in a moment. To be able to place cells under design, a cell library must be attached to the current design. In that way, you have access to all the cells contained in that library. Note that you can have only one library attached to the current file at a time. To access cells in other libraries, you must attach that library or use the cell selector, which will allow you to see multiple cell libraries. And again, we'll look at that in a later video. Let's try attaching one of the cell libraries right now. So we go to Element and Cells, and the cell settings box displays on the screen. Now right now I have a cell library attached to my model, but normally you would go to File and Attach File, because we are attaching a cell library file, and that should pop up the list of MicroStation's predefined cells. Now, I'm using the sample2 cell at the moment, that's why it's highlighted. But note the path at the top of the cell library dialog box. The essential information is workspace, system, and cell. That's the path to the cell library. So select the sample2 cell yourself, and you'll see what I had on the screen before. Now this library only contains 4 cells, but just to complicate things, if we were to click on Display All Cells in a Path, then we would see something a little extra. I'll click on that right now. Notice that we have one extra cell in the list. This is called Earth cell, and this is a custom cell which I use for various illustrations. And this cell is not actually in this cell library. It's elsewhere in a different library, but we're pointing to it here because the path in question is pointed to under the configuration file system. Let me show you what this means. We go to Workspace and Configuration and All, and we're looking for the MS Cell List option. So we'll just drag down. I'll use the wheel instead. Cell List, click on that, and we see that we have a path which is slightly different from the cell library path, which goes to Workspace, Projects, Untitled, and Cell, and everything in that folder. Now, as it happens, I have a cell file in that path, and it only contains that one cell called Earth. So while technically you can only have one cell library attached to the current file, you can actually see more cells by placing them in this path. Now, I don't want to confuse you. This is fairly heavy stuff at the moment, and we'll be looking at configuration files in much later videos. So ignore this for the moment. I'm going to cancel that, and I'm going to turn that off so we're not totally confused. So these are the 4 cells which reside in this sample2 cell library. Now, the first cell is highlighted, and we can see what the cell looks like in the display box. And if we click on each of the separate cells themselves, we can see what's actually contained in the cell. All of that's pretty straightforward. Let's take a quick look at other cell libraries. So go to File again and Attach File. And let's choose something like ArchPA, which is Architectural Patterns. We load that one, and we see that this is quite a long list of cells. and each one contains what are technically called pattern cells for architectural renderings. So if we click on each one, you'll see specific patterns displaying, all of which will make more sense as we start to actually apply cells to a drawing. I'm going to go back to my original Sample 2 cell. And let's take a look at the settings in this cell dialog box. Now you've seen the File menu, where we can create a new cell library, attach a cell library file, attach a folder, detach, compress, etc., etc. The current cell is listed below. We have some options on the headers here. Use shared cells means that when you place a cell in a design, you may choose to have the definition of the cell stored in the design file in one of two ways. If the Use Shared Cells option is off, cell definitions are stored in the file each time the cell is placed. Basically, this means that cells are placed and stored in the file on an individual basis, and they have no connection with each other. Each insertion increases the file size, as you would expect. If the Use Shared Cells option is on the first insertion of a cell, that definition is stored in the file in much the same way as it's stored in a cell library. Subsequent insertions of the cell, called instances, are copies of the file stored definition. The cell library does not need to be attached to place the second and subsequent instances of a shared cell. In addition, if the definition is redefined or changed in the library, as we'll be doing later, all instances of that cell are also redefined. File size is also greatly reduced because of the shared cell definition. In general, you'll usually want to place cells as shared cells for ease of placement, file size reduction, and ease of redefinition. For the moment, though, leave that option off. We've already seen the Display All Cells in the Path option, which takes us out to the configuration files and the extra paths to cell files that contains. The display option for 2D is typically wireframe, but if you have a 3D file, you can see the cell as a shaded rendering. Leave it on wireframe. And lastly, down below we have the cell placement methods, and there are 4 of them. Cell placement, where a single cell is placed in a design. A terminator, where a cell is added to a dimension so that the terminator of a dimension is the actual cell, and this is used for specialized terminators. Point, where the cell is placed as a point. Now we haven't covered points yet, but we'll be doing so in a much later video, so that one can be ignored for the moment. And pattern. This is where we want to pattern an area, an enclosed area, with the cell itself. And that previous cell library we looked at, the ArcPA, contains patterns which are meant for patterning an area. Again, we'll look at those later. And lastly, in the bottom right corner here, we have 4 items which relate to cell management. Here we can edit a cell, delete a cell, create a cell, or share a cell. Again, we'll look at these later. For the moment, take a look at the various cell libraries available from MicroStation using the File and Attach File system. When you've finished looking at those, come back to the Sample 2 cell.